thought we were and we weren't, and we had a great conversation.
We
So
did. And now we're doing a little bit of systems reliability engineering on the fly.
yeah, a little go back and go forward. I will just quickly introduce myself again and Erin, and we'll start here in this conversation, and I'll go back and do some of the overview intro stuff I did before, just so we didn't miss anything. But everyone, I'm Katie Franco. I am the executive director here at GDI, and like many of you, I've been late nights and early mornings, and I'm sorry I forgot to press the right button here. So we are live now. And really excited to have Erin Peterson here with us. She's a board member, a longtime supporter and leader of GDI. And we're gonna have a little chat today about her role and her story. And Erin, I apologize to ask you to say it again, but if you don't mind, can you introduce yourself and your career path a little bit again for us?
Yeah, no problem. And there's never a need to apologize, right? I always tell people, unless you run over a kitten, there's really no need to apologize. Let's see. So where do I start out? So one of the things that I like to tell non-traditional audiences, if people are thinking about like how to move into technology, is a bit of my background before tech. I was a bike messenger. I was a pro mountain biker. I was a hostess at an oyster bar in Seattle. I had a very peripatetic 20s. And because I was in Seattle in the late 90s, when there was a bunch of startups, I got a job at a startup that turned out to be Amazon, which turned into Amazon. We all know Amazon now. And that's really where I learned to code. It's where I learned to how to build products. It's where I learned how to think about scale. And from there, I did a startup, sold the startup, did a couple of startups that failed. And then I went to work for Microsoft as a product manager on a very small team that was trying to build Bing, a search engine, and we built it. From there, I moved back to the engineering side, and that's where I shifted about that point to go to AOL to be their head of open source and legacy engineering. And from there, I've had a variety of executive leadership roles, CTO, leading engineering, product, etc. And here I am talking to
Yay.
you. Okay.
I love that. And I love your story. And every time we talk, I have so many more questions for you. But, we had a really interesting conversation today. And you said the word failure, which I think is really powerful. We had a panel yesterday. It was called My Big Pivot. And it was about several individuals telling their story of how they kind of shifted from education or other fields into tech. And one of the things that I was really interested about was our conversation talked a lot more about how hard it was rather than the kind of, oh, it's so easy. I learned, I went to this boot camp. I got this job, no problem. The panel got real about the challenges in making these pivots. So I know tell us a little bit more about what failure has meant to you and kind of how you've been able to leverage some of those experiences.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was having a conversation with someone last night about failure, and we were talking about a few things. One of the things that I think is really important, and it's sort of a trope at this point, is that failure is part of growth and failure is part of learning. And you also have to understand how much room you have to fail. So for those who don't know, I spent part of my career at the Department of Defense. This was a couple of years ago. And the tolerances for failure at the Department of Defense, for example, are very different than they are in e-commerce systems.
Yeah.
And so I think about this. I think about how my perspective on failure is different now. As a leader, it's really important that I create the room for my teams to fail and to fail safely, and for people to fail and fail safely. Because even in the most constructive, most supportive environment, failure is hard. It is hard to have failed. And I think that when we tell stories, like when I tell the story of my career, it sounds like this, beautiful arc. But one of the things I touched on, for example, is I did a startup I sold, and then I did 2 startups that failed. And at the end of those 2 startups that failed, I'm sort of like, is anybody even going to hire me again?
Mm-hmm.
And then I got hired by Microsoft, which was great because that's a company that values experience and curiosity and ability to collaborate and solve problems. And that, sort of allowed my career to keep going. But there are those moments where you're like, oh my gosh, is anybody going to hire me? Oh my gosh, am I ever going to get paid again? Am I ever going to get paid at all for this? And having a set of people around you, having a network of people around you that you can go to that will just buck you up is
Mhm.
really, really important. And so when
Yeah.
I create these opportunities to fail, I make sure, there are opportunities for wins along the way, even on a risky project, a risky track, so that people have that opportunity to celebrate and buck up.
Yeah. No, I think that's so important, and I think so much of the feedback this week too are people being like, "I have been doing this by myself in a virtual,
Mhm.
vacuum, and all of a sudden there are all these other people trying to get their first job in tech and trying to learn, and it feels so wonderful to connect." And I know you talk a lot about networks and
Mhm.
that power, but, if you could talk a little bit about kinda how you've built some of those networks. It's always good people to be like, "Build a network." You're like, "Great, how? I'm sitting in my basement, like, what do I do?"
So, one of my closest friends, who's also really well known in tech, I've been friends with now for almost 15 years. And I became friends with him because I was working on a tricky technology problem. I realized somebody else had solved this problem. I just emailed this guy out of the blue. I got his email address off an old blog, emailed him like, "Hey, can you meet me for coffee? We're in the same city." He's like, "Sure, I'll meet you for coffee." And one of the things and before that, by the way, I don't think I'd ever reached out to a stranger for coffee. I was pre Tinder, right? This was not my life path. One of the things that taught me is that most people are receptive to a ping, a gentle ping saying, "Hey, do you have 5 minutes for a call or 15 minutes for a call?" So that's been a really powerful way that I've learned to build my network because I take the calls from people who say, "Hey, like I have one this afternoon, friend of a friend, hey, they just need 10 minutes for advice." Like I'll open myself up to that. And by the way, this goes both ways. So sometimes people think, well, you're an executive, you have advice to give. But there are definitely times when I call people who are 10, 15, 20 years behind me in their careers because they have a unique perspective that I lack about, what it's like to be a junior year engineer. I've forgotten, right? So this goes both ways. So that's one powerful thing. And then the second powerful thing is that those loose connections, those loose ties you build over time become more and more and more and more important. So, first of all, don't burn bridges, if you can. So, that's a hard lesson that I've learned. And another thing that I've learned, and I just was reminded of this week, there was this guy I worked with on a project like 15 years ago. I thought this guy hated me. I'm like, oh my God, he never wants to see me again. I happened to run into him at a cocktail party. And he was really excited to see me. I was like, clearly it's been 15 years. He's got me confused with somebody else, but he didn't. Like he remembered me and he had this very warm memory of our time working together. And I was like, well, that's really interesting. I wish I'd known that 15 years ago, right?
Mhm.
And so assume goodwill, assume good intent, build those relationships. I think don't be shy.
Yeah. And do you think that because so much about this event and why we do it here at GDI is that we know it's all about confidence, right? Like we know that we've seen people in our classes building the skill, doing the thing, showing up
Mhm.
for the classes, doing the work, doing the homework. But then, we put together a hackathon and the first question I get is, am I good enough? Can
Yeah.
I do it? And I think that holds us back even from saying, hey, Aaron, can we talk? Because I'm like, Aaron, I'm not as good of a tech as you. I feel like I'm going to be embarrassed talking to you or I'm going to waste
Mm.
your time. I mean, it's just, I don't know how we've been like sort of conditioned so much to say we're not good enough. And I think we just hold us back in so many ways.
That is that's the perennial challenge, right? So we spend so much time building confidence. Look at the work Brendan Jen is doing, for example, to build confidence. It's amazing. There's there's a few things that you learn after years in technology. One is that everything changes about every 5 to 10 years. The things I'm working on, containers were not a thing 10 years ago. I tried to convince the team to adopt DevOps 7 years ago. They laughed me out of the room, said it was never going to be a thing, right? APIs, not a thing 20 years ago. And this means that if you're going to build a career in technology, you get really comfortable not knowing things. And
Mhm.
you get really comfortable asking people about things. And you learn that the difference that I've observed anyway between the absolute best technologists and the weaker ones is the absolute best ones have an utter lack of ego when it comes to asking questions and saying, I have never heard of that framework or I've never heard of that language. Like I remember a CTO about 10 years ago now saying, what is Go? And And that is one thing that if you can tap into that and just find that confidence, find safe people, find a collaborative space like this one to just build the confidence to be able to ask questions, it's a game changer.
Mm-hmm.
It's a game changer.
Yeah, I think the thing I always try to remember too is like everybody's making it up.
Everybody's making it up.
Everybody's making like nobody like especially in technology where like you said it changes so fast. There's
Mhm.
nobody with 50 years of experience and go like it didn't exist.
Right. That's a great example. And also, there's never one way to solve a problem. I rarely use absolutes, but there is never one way to solve a problem. There are always multiple ways to solve a problem. And it's the way that individuals figure out how to solve problems and teams figure out how to solve problems that shape industry changing solutions and that shape better user experiences and that lead to breakthroughs. There are always multiple ways to solve a problem. However you solve it, you solve it. As long as you can monitor it, as long as you can measure it, as long as you can see how stably it's running, like that's a vetted solution.
Yeah, totally. I want to ask you more about the process and sort of the industry, but Sujin had a question, so I want to go back to something. She's asking about, you mentioned cultivating an environment to fail safely, and kind of like, what does that actually look like to you? And she's saying she's been struggling with that because she's a people manager and trying to figure out how to practice it. So how do you put that into practice?
So, you know, I realized a couple of years ago on a project that as much as so for my direct reports, I never criticize in public, try and ask questions, establish an outcome and ways to measure how to get to an outcome so that we can all figure out, are we getting to the outcome? So you're measuring how people are moving toward an outcome. You're not measuring people, right? And I think that's an important thing to do as a leader. And a couple of years ago, I guess 2 years ago now, I learned a really important lesson from a very junior person on my team. She was a couple of years out of college. And I knew her really well. I'd known her while she was in college. And I didn't know this, but we had a meeting together. I thought I created this really collaborative space. Turned out she walked out of this meeting and cried. And somebody else called and said, "Hey, so and so was crying after the meeting." And I reached out and I said, "Hey, what could I have done to have created a better environment?" And she said, "There was nothing that you could have done to create an environment because you're an executive. Just going in front of you, just answering questions in front of you is so stressful, whether I know you or not, that I'm just going to walk out of there and cry." I was like, all right. So what I learned from that is that it is really important that I support leaders and their leaders and build those lateral sources of safety. And so I try and create events and meetings where people can get together and build connections where I'm just not present, right? And that takes a different kind of leadership. Like that's leadership by influence. But it's really important that you're building those lateral connections and you're building those connections throughout an organization and that you're demonstrating that, right? That you take feedback, that you don't flinch, that you admit your failures. So that's sort of the best recipe I can offer.
Yeah, that's a pretty good one. So yeah, so now I just have some questions about, we've also talked a lot about, and we've had a lot of chat in Slack and in these conversations about breaking into the industry and, how hard it is and just the discouragement that folks are seeing when they've applied for 80 jobs and they've gotten one interview or the technical interview just floors them. Any thought, talk to us a little bit about your experience in that industry and kind of, are we really making a place where we all talk DEI, but have we really set the table to bring folks of non-traditional backgrounds into the industry?
No. And you've heard me get on a soapbox about this, so
I
I'll
love it.
avoid being on a soapbox. But
Soapbox up it.
I don't believe in testing. I don't think I do not believe in testing. I don't think that testing demonstrates anything other than somebody can pass a test. It doesn't demonstrate how collaborative they are, which is so important on an engineering team. It doesn't demonstrate how curious they are, which is important to be able to get solutions. It doesn't demonstrate how willing and able they are to go out and find documentation and figure out something new and move forward. And by the way, I feel completely vindicated at the articles that have come out the last few days that show that everybody's been cheating in the testing. It's not actually an indicator of anything. What I do believe is, an interview process where candidates are vetted for, their ability to contribute at their level, whether they're a junior engineer and a junior contributor or a senior engineer and a senior contributor. Is this person collaborative? Can this person solve the problems that we have in front of us now? Can this person go out 2 years from now and help us solve the new problems that we're going to have then? And what that requires is a leadership team and a set of engineering managers who are willing to be really thoughtful about the problems that they have to solve, write good job descriptions, and then go out and look for good people, not just like pull, copy, paste job descriptions from other companies and say, we need these 80 things when you don't really. You need people to be able to solve this problem. So what I encourage folks is that if you're the kind of person who's non-traditional and you're breaking into an industry, find a project that is looking for the people like you. I mean, there are projects out there, there are volunteer opportunities out there where you're going to be able to make a contribution, and then you can point to it, and then you can work your way up into companies. Look for those smaller companies, look for those smaller opportunities. And I know that takes, a lot of shots on goal, to use a sports metaphor. But that's what it takes when you're first breaking in. Have something you can point to. Have people you can point to.
Yeah, and I know, you've been a cheerleader of this event and some of the events that we've done that are more build a project, get something
Mhm.
done, work on a team. I mean, how does that translate for you when you're thinking about building teams? Like if someone comes in and they don't have a CS bachelor's, but man, they've done 3 hackathons and they were the team leader on the last one. I mean, how does that stand out for you?
That means more, and that means a lot. That means a lot. I think that there's increasingly awareness among companies who are hiring technical talent that particularly as we shift to a no-code, low-code world, that what you want are people who are going to take on those simpler to construct projects, make sure they're delivered well, and then observe them to make sure they're operating as expected. I think that that demonstrated ability to go to a hackathon, build something, lead a team, as you said, is very important. It's
Yeah.
more meaningful than just going to a boot camp, for example.
Yeah, and it's not easy. Like I definitely can see some folks and they're like, how do I do this? And where do I get this done? And who can help me? And I don't have time. I mean, I
Mhm.
feels like it's like all the real things that a job would look for, right?
I was just thinking that, like, that's what an engineering job looks like, right? Like, people think when they think software engineer, they think somebody sitting there coding, constantly tapping their fingers. And that is not what the job looks like. The job looks a lot more like a hackathon
Mhm. Every day.
every day for years.
So, I love that. And that kind of translates to the next question I have is like, sort of what are some of the jobs and things like if you're going to give advice to somebody or you're mentoring somebody, and they're like, gosh, Erin, I just really love JavaScript. What kind of jobs or what's the field that you think people should be focusing on or the skills that people should be learning?
So there's a few things that I've been advising new people into the field over the last year and a half. One is that, if you go back 10 years ago, 20 years ago, definitely 10 years ago, the way to break into software was to figure out how to do front-end development, right? HTML, Python, etc. And now I think there's a couple of other tracks that are really rich for exploration and rich for entry-level jobs. There's data engineering and data visualization. And it is so hard to find data engineering people and data visualization people that there are ample courses and certificates available. You can study this for free on Azure classes and the AWS classes. And I think Oracle has a couple now too. So that's one place, the data engineering, data visualization, and also cloud configuration, cloud management, and systems reliability engineering. So important. And also very hard to find people in those three disciplines. And also a good place where you can go and you can get all the certificates and training you want and desire on Azure and AWS. And you do those, they're free to very cheap. You do those and you put those certificates on your LinkedIn profile and you really pop for recruiters.
Yeah, that's really cool. Because I do think people, there's so much to learn. And so many people ask all the time, do I have to learn all of it? Where do I start? What do I do next? I'm just know Python. Is that enough? Can I get a job with that? And of course, if you are, maybe of the male identifying gender, that's not a problem, right? You'll apply for a job with one Python class under your belt. But I think, I know our community really wants to have a little bit more of that, like, what's my certificate? What do I need to get that job?
Yeah, it's a perspective from the CTO role is that being a CTO is unique in the C-suite of companies, and that if you're a CFO, for example, you've probably done all the finance things of every team that reports to you. If you're a head of marketing, you've probably done all the marketing things. If you're a CTO today, there's no way that you've done all the things. You haven't done data engineering, plus cloud configuration, plus data visualization, plus front-end development, plus full stack development. You just haven't. Because if you've spent your time learning all those skills, you haven't spent that time learning the skills to be strategic and be a CTO. And the job of a CTO is really to create the environment for great engineering to occur and for great engineering product to run, to be built and run. And this is something that hopefully gives confidence to people who are breaking into the field. You don't have to know all the things. You cannot know all the things. You can know your thing really, really well and break in with your thing that you do really, really well. Your job is going to change, your company is going to change, technology solutions are going to change, and you're going to be able to grow with it. So worry about doing your thing really well, that thing that you love to do.
Yeah, that's awesome. And shout it from the rooftops, right? Put it on LinkedIn, post about your thing. Just like, don't be shy about the thing. Even if you just learn the thing, like this,
Mhm.
whatever project we do here at the hackathon, put it on your LinkedIn. I've seen some
Totally.
people doing that, and the chatter's great. I can tell people like, oh, tell me, I want to see your project when it's done, post
Mhm.
it, all that stuff.
That was one of the most powerful things I saw come out of our last hackathon, is that the contributors to the hackathon, the people who engaged in the hackathon afterward, built this fantastic reverberation chamber on LinkedIn, which meant that they were all not only excitedly chatting about each other's projects on LinkedIn, which lifted everybody's profile, but they continued. Like I saw some folks last week, they've continued to support and reverberate and lift each other up. And that really is incredibly helpful on LinkedIn because it does help push your profile up to the top. So I encourage everybody in this hackathon to make some friends and, go out there and reverberate.
Yeah,
Lift each
absolutely.
other up.
Tell the story.
Tell the story.
Sujin has another question here. She's asking, if you don't have a mathematics background, do you think the industry takes you seriously as a budding data engineer?
That is such a good question. So does the industry, thinking about, I'm doing a thing where I'm narrow banding and broad banding. So does the industry take you seriously? There are always going to be people and teams and companies who like to say things like, well, if we're going to be great, everybody here has to work 80 hours under their desk and everybody has to have a math degree, et cetera, et cetera. That does not necessarily mean that the company is great or what they're building is great or that the people are great. And I will say that it is incredibly helpful when you move into data engineering to understand math and understand math concepts. It's just really, really helpful. But it's not the end all or be all for entering the space. And if you enter the space and you learn how to think about data and you learn how to process data and you learn how to visualize data and have data make sense for people, that is very, very powerful. And ultimately, the people who can do that are the people who are taken seriously.
Mhm. Yeah, that's great. Go for it, Sujin.
Go for it. Yeah, for sure.
You don't need a math background. I love it. So yeah, let's talk again. I know you just kind of jumping into the LinkedIn and networking, and again, just to talk about that again, because I think we can't talk about it enough. You know, I think folks through this event have found some ways to have networking. Any other places or spaces you think people need to be in to kind of build up that like core group around them?
That's a great question. Um, you know, Let me ponder that. It has gotten trickier with COVID,
Mhm.
right? Because we used to be able to say easily, we'll go to this conference, meet with these people, show up at this hackathon. And there are so few virtual events like this one. I mean,
Mhm.
this one is ideal, right, to build a network. I have found that there are volunteer opportunities that I've become part of. So there's data engineers for good project that I'm working on. There's a project that I just saw launched 2 weeks ago, for example. It's a new browser. Nobody's built a browser in like 20 years. It's a new browser. So I immediately raised my hand and said, I'm like, I will test that, right? There's another software project actually last week that I raised my hand. It's called aboard.io. I love it so much. Everybody should go out and try and get an invitation. And if they don't let you in, email me or text me, find me on LinkedIn. I'll try and get you an invitation. And it's amazing, right? And I just love this project so much. And as I use this project, I've been collecting information about bugs and performance. And so I've been sending that back to the team that's founded it. And so now they're getting back to me, and I'm building relationships there that I haven't had. So I think that there are ways to sort of find these projects that are out there and just slowly build your relationships. It's hard and it takes time, but once you have it, it's just so valuable, and then it sort of takes on a life of its own.
Yeah, I love that. And I think too, that's something where I think we build up these boundaries of like, oh, I'm just brand new. I only took one JavaScript class. They probably don't want my feedback, but like they do. Like they really do want people to use their stuff and to practice and to benefit from it.
They really do. So one of the features, I was playing around this week with a feature, and I realized it was missing something that's super useful and important. And I just emailed them like, hey, you're missing this thing. I'm like, oh my gosh, how could we have missed that? And that had nothing to do with what I know about technology or scale or data engineering. It was just me as a person observing that, oh, this feature could be improved if it did this in addition to that. And that kind of, it's more product feedback, but it is a great way to build relationships with small projects.
Yeah, that's super strong. Someone just asked, what was the name of that project? Was it Board.io?
Oh, it's
Aboard.
aboard.io.
So ABOA. Yeah, okay. Aboard.io.
Yeah. I don't see the chat function, or I would add it in here, but find me on LinkedIn afterward and hit me up and I'll put it there.
I dropped it in.
Ah, thank you.
But everyone should find you on LinkedIn and look you up.
Yes, everybody should find me on LinkedIn. It'll give you a boost. It'll give you an algo boost. Find me on LinkedIn.
Yeah. And then Erin, our first session of this couple of days, we kicked it off talking about health and IT. And had this amazing panel of people who are researchers and doctors, and just this really dynamic conversation about the field and the space and the innovation and the opportunity. And I know you've been really immersed in the space, and it's been a wild year for any issue when it comes to health and women's health. What's on your mind? What have you been working on? What are you thinking about?
Great question. So a few things. So one, it is an amazing space, and we need to get as many different, diverse perspectives into the space as we can. It is so important. I can tell you a funny story at the end if you want. The other thing I've been thinking a lot about lately is data privacy and data portability. So everybody hears about HIPAA, and everybody knows that HIPAA is always used to say we can't share that information. It's HIPAA protected. But people forget that HIPAA is both about privacy and also portability. And when the HIPAA Act was written, there was a lot of thinking about privacy, but there wasn't a lot of ability for records to be easily ported between systems. And that technology is maturing really quickly. And so there's an awful lot of opportunity, which means there's an awful lot of regulatory pressure right now to figure out how to do things that are portable, like figure out how to get that data from a Fitbit into a useful patient profile so that the patient can bring their Fitbit data in to talk to their doctor, right? So that I think there's a lot of interesting stuff there. And then one of the other things that I think about a lot is the privacy of patient data. And I think about how as people and patients and consumers, it's so important. And what a lot of people don't realize is that any data that's protected by HIPAA is subject to administrative subpoena. So you don't have to go to court to get a subpoena. You just go through an administrative bureaucratic system, and it can be a local government, a state government, or a federal government, right? I just saw your head cock.
Yeah.
Like let that sink in for a minute, right? The importance of that. And consumer product data is not protected by HIPAA. So Simple Health is Emmy. Emmy is a period tracker. We're the only period tracker that has never sold the data or used the data for anything other than patient period tracking. Because Emmy is a consumer product, it's not covered by HIPAA, which means that it is not subject to regulatory or administrative subpoena the same way, which is really interesting. And what I'm seeing in the world is this interesting shift. I think of it as overreach. I'll get off my soapbox on this, but this interesting shift where there are government entities, schools, for example, in Florida, are requesting that athletes provide their medical records in order to take part in sports. This is a long thing, right? You get a note from your doctor. But now schools are requiring that athletes provide ongoing access to ongoing medical records to participate in sports. And you can easily see a scenario where there's a person who was born a woman, a young woman with ovaries, a young person with ovaries who has their period for 6 months, doesn't have it for 2 months, and suddenly it starts again. And then the government has that data. And that is potentially problematic in some states. And so I think that understanding what it means to architect a product from the ground up so that that patient data is secure is incredibly important. And a lot of people say, we're trying to get to market quickly, we're going to build that in later. And it is really hard to build later. So try very hard to build it in upfront.
Yeah, I mean, it just first of all, you know, absorb some of that. Second of all, and I won't soapbox on it, but it feels like this space is ripe for opportunity for new
Mhm.
folks jumping into tech. And we always say that when we leave people out of spaces, we're leaving out their creativity, their minds, their needs. And in this space in particular, if we don't have, you know, an inclusive workforce building tech, health tech, IT, you know, solutions, we're gonna skip a whole thing. People aren't even, oh, that isn't like I can see, and no offense to our amazing male allies and counterparts, but I could see, oh, that's no big deal. We could track that data. We don't, but
Mhm.
probably every single person, many people listening to this go, I know exactly what they're looking for, and I can see why that's a problem.
Right. So do you want to hear my funny story about
Yeah.
this? So I had a mixed engineering team, very diverse engineering team, men, women, people born, whole panoply of self-identification and self-expression. And we're in this meeting, and one of the people who was about a 50-year-old male, American male, was listening to, you know, a good portion of the room talk about their experience at their general physician. And finally, he's like, well, wait a second. He's like, when they ask you about your sexual wellness and your happiness and satisfaction with your sex life, why don't you answer these questions then? And the whole room went like this. And we were all looking at him. And he's like, I was like, wait a minute, you get asked that? He said, yeah, I get asked that every time I go in. And every person in the room who identified as male was like, yeah. Like they all started talking about it. They're like, no, we see, look at the look on your face. You're like, yeah. And I asked another doctor, he's like, oh, that's a primary indicator of male wellness. And to a person, not a single person I know who identifies as a woman who's been in another gender, and I've been asking everybody now. I've never had anybody ask me. And it was this huge light bulb moment for us about how different the medical experience is. And it was very funny too. And so now we all joke about it, but it's not that funny. But
Yeah.
it was just this huge, like, how do we not know that, right? And that is the importance of diversity in a room.
Absolutely. That is so like such a great story to really highlight that, you know, and it's just about, you know, elbowing our way in, I guess, at this point.
Mhm. Yeah, and as you said, having male allies at the table, right? Like diversity goes in all directions. And it is really important that you have real diversity at a table. And people are comfortable saying the thing that, is everybody gonna think I'm nuts for asking this question? It's really important.
Yeah, it's so important. Well, if anyone else has any questions for Erin, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I could talk to you all day, Erin, but any other thoughts or just, you know, wisdom as some of these folks in our community here are building and creating and kind of finalizing their deadlines? Any thoughts or wisdoms that you have that you want to pass on?
Yes, these last few hours, the last percentage of a hackathon is so hard, right? You're trying to cram, you're trying to get it done, you're trying to get it finished enough, you're trying to not be nervous about going in front of the judges. And one of the things that was fantastic the last time we did this hackathon, I'm sure everybody has heard it, is that the experience of going up in front of the judges was really, really fun. There was great feedback. It was very supportive. The rest of the audience was supportive. And so, while you're, sprinting here to the end of this event, think about getting your project done. Think about getting your work done. Think about getting it done enough, but know that you're going to be really well supported when it gets to the judging. So don't spend a lot of energy worrying about being nervous about being that. It's going to be great.
Yeah, there's an easy judging group. It's a very supportive. We're gonna make sure everyone has a good time. Yeah, I love that. Well, I don't think there's any other questions, so I will let you get back to your day and your lovely weather out your window. And are you in Rhode Island or are you on the West Coast?
Rhode Island.
Rhode Island. Yeah, it looks lovely. Well,
Come on down.
yeah, thank you so much, Erin. I really appreciate you being here. Thank you for the wisdom and the guidance and just your insight. It's always so helpful from the executive side to kind of, and also great to, I think, for our community to know that there are executives like you who are thinking through these issues like testing and others and how to get people in the door. I think it gives everyone confidence that there are amazing leaders out there who are supporting them.
So many. And thank you, Sujin, for your questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. All right. I didn't, Kate, I don't know if I'm going to go off for a second and